I knew I was leaving for good when I closed the door without looking back. I didn't leave a note, didn't call the next day, didn't tell anyone. I just vanished. I took with me 2 suitcases, a scar on my chest, and the conviction that the love that once set me ablaze now only burned me in silence. People think love dies with betrayals, lies, or shouting matches, but sometimes it unravels slowly, in the absence of gestures, in the accumulation of waiting, in the echo of words, never spoken. I didn't leave because I stopped loving. I left because I couldn't bear being the only one trying to save what we were both letting drown. Every morning was a test of endurance, every night an exercise in pretense. And when I realized I was starting to doubt my own worth, I understood that staying was worse than leaving. There was something cruel in that routine where we crossed paths like strangers who knew each other's wounds too well, but no longer cared to bandage them. I loved him. I loved him like few can love, with surrender, with faith, with the naivety of someone who believes that love, just by existing, is enough. But love, I learned too late, needs to be nurtured, protected, cared for, as if it were fragile. And we left it out in the cold, and I left myself out in the cold. I carried the memories like shards of glass in my chest, every step away from him hurt, but it was a clean pain, different from the one I felt staying. As the city faded behind me and the road started to feel like a one-way path, I felt a guilty relief. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time I felt alive by my own choice. His name kept pulsing in me like a whisper that refused to die. But I kept going anyway, because I needed to forget. Or at the very least, I needed to try. For weeks, my breathing carried a strange rhythm, as if every inhale still held his name, trapped between my ribs. It was a painful relief to walk through streets where no one knew my story, where I could just be a lonely woman and not the one who gave up on love. The silence of a new city offered me refuge. I started filling my days with simple tasks, washing clothes, tending to plants, organizing drawers that didn't exist before me, as if organizing the outside would be enough to contain the chaos within. But the truth is, the wreckage of what we were still haunted me. I relived entire scenes from our past with the clarity of someone who's watched that movie 1,000 times. His touch on my shoulder when he thought I was asleep. The eyes that couldn't lie, but also couldn't ask for forgiveness. The long silences in our final nights together, when all we had left was the distance between 2 people lying side by side. There was an almost sweet pain in remembering, but also a silent fury, not against him, but against myself, for waiting so long, for believing love could survive on its own, for erasing myself day after day in the name of a hope that never came. Slowly, I built a version of myself that smiled at the market, greeted neighbors, and even listened to music without a pang in my chest. But at night, when the house fell silent, I became that woman at the door again, hesitating between staying and leaving. And as much as I had chosen to go, my body still remembered everything I'd left behind. His scent, the way he said my name when he was tired, that final morning when he tried to touch me and I pulled away. Not out of anger, but because I was already emotionally too far gone. The love may not have died there, but it fell into a coma. And I left without knowing if it would ever wake up. I started to think that maybe some stories don't have happy endings, and that wasn't a failure, but a liberation. Even so, there were moments when his absence took shape, in the empty side of the bed, in the laugh no one else could draw from me, in the conversations I rehearsed alone and would never have the courage to say aloud. I didn't blame him anymore. With time, I realized blaming was just a way to keep the bond alive, and I didn't want bonds anymore. I wanted peace. I wanted silence. Above all, I wanted to be enough for myself, without needing the validation of someone who no longer knew how to reach me. But even absence screams when the longing is too great, and I had to learn to live with that echo. It wasn't about going back or holding on to hope. It was about rebuilding a life on the ruins of another, without erasing the memory of what was, but also without living trapped by the ghost of what could have been. And in that slow reconstruction, between small steps forward and emotional relapses no one saw, I was, without realizing, making space for a version of myself I didn't yet know. One that knew how to leave, yes, but that maybe one day, if everything changed, would also know how to return. I tried to erase him from me as quietly as possible, like deleting an old song from a playlist without wanting to hear the opening notes. There were no dramatic outbursts, no vow of never again, just a growing absence that started as discomfort and ended up becoming structure. I carried on with my new routine, like someone stepping on broken glass without showing pain. Each decision made without consulting his eyes was a small victory, but also a cruel reminder that there was no us anymore. The city I settled in seemed made for fresh starts, full of people who smiled at me without knowing what I carried on my shoulders. No one there knew the bitter taste of the nights I waited for him to come home early. No one suspected that behind my polite good mornings was a woman who still caught herself staring at her phone as if it might ring at any moment. But the phone didn't ring. It never rang again. And that, in a way, was a blessing. I needed that. Silence to hear myself again. As contradictory as it was, my freedom only made sense if I had the courage to cut every invisible tie still binding me to the past. But the heart is a disobedient organ. It collects crumbs and calls it a feast. And so, even far away, even resolute, I kept returning mentally to our last conversations, the cold looks, the times he asked for patience while I asked for presence. It was a tug of war disguised as a relationship. I held on to the frayed ends of a rope already undone, but I only realized it when I found my hands empty. And perhaps the cruelest part was realizing he never tried to stop me. He accepted my goodbye like someone signing a contract they knew had already expired. There was no attempt at reconciliation, no questions, no pleas, just silence, a silence that screamed inside me. I thought I'd feel free, but deep down I felt forgotten, as if everything we were had been too easy to abandon, as if he hadn't suffered, as if I'd been the only one bleeding in that farewell. That corroded me. More than the longing, more than the memories, more than the love unlived. It was the emotional abandonment, the feeling of having loved alone in those final months, the realization that I left and he didn't even need to look for me. That pain was the hardest to heal, and even when I started getting used to the idea that he was part of the past, there was still a corner of me that waited for an explanation, a letter, a reunion, something that would make sense again. But nothing came, just life, with its insistence on moving forward. And I moved forward too, not whole but standing, because sometimes that's already a kind of victory. It was on an ordinary late afternoon, without warning or premonition, that the past decided to cross my path again. I was coming back from a small market, with light bags and my mind occupied with mundane lists when I saw him standing across the street. It was him, Ethan, the man I loved in silence for so long, and whom I left believing I'd never see again. For a moment my body froze, my feet locked as if the asphalt had become too sick to move through. I don't know how long I stood there, but the seconds felt like hours as my mind wrestled with the avalanche of memories that erupted without permission. He didn't see me, or if he did, he pretended not to, and maybe that hurt even more. Because there he was, alive, present, real, as if all those years hadn't pierced through me. I didn't know if he was just passing through, if he lived there, if it was just a twist of fate. But my heart, that merciless traitor, beat with a force I thought I'd forgotten. His face carried marks that weren't there before, lines around. His eyes, darker hair with silver strands visible even from a distance. But his shoulders were still the same ones I'd fallen asleep on, crying so many times. I went home dazed, like someone who's seen a ghost and tries to pretend it was their imagination. The bags fell to the floor as soon as I walked in, and for the first time in a long time, I cried without being able to hold it back. It wasn't a cry of pain or longing. It was an old lament, stored in some basement of my soul, surfacing because something inside me had finally been unearthed. That night, I dreamed of him. I dreamed of the day I left. But in the dream, he ran after me. He called my name. He begged me to stay. I woke up with a wet face, a dry throat, and a question that burned. What if he had changed? What if the man I left behind wasn't the same anymore? I tried to push the thoughts away, to return to logic, but it was useless. The wound reopened on its own. For the next few days, I tried to ignore the possibility of a reunion, like someone trying to push a persistent light back into the dark. But something in me was already different. A dormant part had awakened. And even if I didn't yet know what I'd do, I realized that the forever I thought was dead had just opened its eyes. I thought I could ignore it, that it would be enough to keep busy, avoid the same paths, pretend that brief glimpse hadn't destabilized everything I'd been rebuilding with so much effort. But there are encounters that happen inside us before they happen in the world, and from the moment I saw him standing on the sidewalk, my soul stopped resting. I started noticing him where he shouldn't be. In the man crossing my path in the square, in the similar tone of a stranger's voice at the cafe, even in the woody scent that made me turn my head in the supermarket. Ethan was everywhere, not because he actually was, but because my mind, treacherous and hungry, sought him in every shadow. And then, a week later, he appeared again. This time, there was no street to separate us. We were in the same space, the same silence, under the same time. He walked into the bookstore I visited on Saturdays, and for a moment reality dissolved. I saw the same man who used to leave notes inside my books, who said my laugh deserved its own shelf. But this Ethan also carried something new in his gaze. He wasn't the same as before, and that unsettled me. There were no words, just a slight, almost imperceptible wave and a look that hurt more than any sentence. He saw me. I knew he saw me. And instead of running or hiding behind any pretense, I held his gaze. An eternity passed between one blink and another. I left the bookstore before he could approach, and on the way back, my heart no longer knew where it belonged. Something inside me was shifting, a subtle but definitive change. I didn't seek him out, but I didn't avoid him either. I started walking slowly, as if a part of me was allowing fate to do its work. It wasn't hope. It was a kind of silent surrender, as if I accepted that some stories don't end with a goodbye. They just rest until the characters are ready. And maybe, just maybe, we were starting to be ready. I didn't expect to see him again so soon, but fate, that unpredictable also, seemed determined to test the limits of my reconstruction. In the days that followed, our paths began to cross with an almost symbolic frequency, as if the universe had decided to slowly stitch back together the threads that were once cut. Each new encounter was wrapped in a silence heavy with everything we hadn't yet said. But the eyes, oh, the eyes said so much. He looked at me differently now, like someone recognizing a woman who no longer needed saving but still deserved to be chosen. And I, as much as I tried to keep my expression under control, felt my soul tremble with every inch of closeness. There was no conversation between us, no apologies exchanged, just presence, a dense presence, full of meaning, memories, and gaps. One morning, I found him sitting on a bench in the park where I usually walked. He had a book open on his lap, but his eyes were lost on the horizon. I passed by him like someone passing a question mark, not knowing whether to stop, retreat, or keep pretending. He saw me. He waved again. And in that restrained gesture, there was more truth than in the long conversations we once had. I don't know if it was regret, longing, or just the realization that there was still something of us there, unfinished, suspended. But I didn't leave this time. I sat on the bench beside him, without touching him, without asking anything. I just sat. And together in silence, we watched time pass. There was no relief, there was no catharsis, but there was something stronger, acceptance. We stayed there for long minutes, breathing the same air, sharing the same time, like two castaways meeting on the same island after years adrift. When I got up, he didn't try to hold me back, and I didn't expect him to. But as I walked away, I felt a new story beginning to be written, one that didn't need promises to exist. Something had changed in me. I no longer felt anger. I no longer felt resentment. What remained was an almost solemn calm, as if my heart had found a resting place, even without knowing what would come next. And maybe that's what maturing means, knowing how to be close without demanding, knowing how to feel without charging, knowing that sometimes loving is just staying there, even after everything. The following week, life went on as if nothing had happened, but inside me, something had definitively shifted. I no longer lived just to forget. Now, every gesture I made seemed to leave room for a new possibility, however faint, however uncertain. I kept up with my commitments, my contained routine, but his memory no longer came as an open wound. It came as an unanswered question. I wondered if the man I saw on the park bench was the same one I left behind, or if time had shaped him in a way I could never have imagined. And more than that, I wondered if I was still the woman who left, because there was now a maturity in me that only pain grants, a kind of clarity that comes when you no longer expect anything. And then, on a rainy afternoon, we crossed paths again. I was leaving a small cafe, and he was coming in. This time there was no hesitation. He looked at me with sweetness, and a silent invitation passed through us. I sat with him, like someone accepting a chapter that fate insists on writing, and there, face to face, words began to emerge. No accusations, no forced attempts at rebuilding, just truths, the ones we kept silent out of pride, fear, or ignorance. He told me he'd gone through deep losses after I left, that the silence left in the house was crueler than he'd imagined, that he tried to move on but couldn't give himself to anyone else. And I, for the first time, said I left not for lack of love, but for lack of care, for exhaustion. Our eyes welled up, but the tears were no longer of pain. They were of recognition, of relief, of freedom. When I left that cafe, I didn't feel like we had reconciled or closed any cycle, but something had been healed. There was peace between us, a light silence that no longer weighed. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of a new space, cleaner, truer. A space where love didn't need to prove anything, just be. Because after so much time, so many comings and goings and silences and absences, the most striking thing was realizing he still looked at me like I was a choice. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to look back like someone who also chooses, not what was, but what could still be. The next morning I woke with a strange feeling, not anxiety, not expectation, but a rare serenity, as if something inside me had finally found rest. I got up without haste, drank my coffee slowly, and looked out the window with the sense that time had finally started moving at the same rhythm as my heart. Something had changed deeply between us, even without any concrete decision being made. There were no promises, no plans, no belated declarations, but there was a kind of presence that filled without suffocating, that stayed even when it wasn't physically there. I spent the day in silence, respecting this newborn lightness, almost afraid of breaking it if I moved too much. Late in the afternoon, I went for a walk without a destination, just with the intention of breathing the world outside. And then, without surprise or warning, I found Ethan again. He saw me from afar and smiled, not the smile from before, heavy, with apologies and longing, but a new one, calm, full of acceptance. We approached each other like people who no longer need to explain anything. We walked side by side, without touching, without haste. We spoke little. The silence between us already said everything. At one point, he stopped and looked at me in a way that pierced through me entirely. And that's when I realized he wasn't there to win me back. He was there because he had found me again, and I, in turn, was no longer the woman waiting for grand gestures. I was someone who knew how to recognize presence, consistency, and tension. He asked if we could keep walking, just that. Nothing about the past, nothing about the future, just keep going. And in that simple invitation, there was more love than in all the failed attempts before. I nodded, not with words, but with my whole body, with the heart that had finally understood that true love doesn't demand haste or guarantees. We walked for hours, as if we had all the days in the world, and in that afternoon that slowly turned to night, I understood that it wasn't about going back to what we were, but about creating something new, from what remained, what endured, what matured. Because sometimes love triumphs not when it resurges with force, but when it remains in silence, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. In the days that followed, we didn't plan meetings, but we kept finding each other. We didn't set times, but our steps seemed to know where the other would be. It was as if the whole city conspired to bring us closer without effort. There was none of the urgency that once existed between us, that need to possess, to control, to define what we were. This time, everything had a different rhythm, calmer, more mature, more real. We started getting to know each other again, like two strangers carrying a shared memory, but who now needed to discover what truly remained. Ethan listened to me with a kind of attention I'd never felt before. He didn't try to correct what I said, didn't justify himself. He just listened. And I, who once felt the need to explain everything, found myself speaking with more ease, like someone no longer carrying the weight of being understood. We were two survivors of a love that almost died, and maybe because of that, we knew nothing could be lived in haste anymore. We went for walks, had coffee, sat on random city benches like two accomplices who had already hurt each other too much to risk doing it again. But there was something different now. He started showing me parts of himself I'd never known, childhood stories, old fears, vulnerabilities he once hid out of pride. And I, in turn, let myself be seen too, without masks, without armor, without the trap of being the strong woman all the time. For the first time, we looked at each other without past or debt. We started building a present that didn't depend on what if or why not before. I caught myself smiling alone after seeing him, thinking of little phrases he said, remembering the way he brushed his shoulder against mine when something moved him. His presence now wasn't a shadow of what we had. It was something else, something new, and yet familiar. I knew I could go on alone, and he could too. But there was a glow in the middle of the path that kept us coming back, and that, to me, already said a lot. It wasn't dependency, it was choice. A calm, free, renewed choice. And it was in that in-between time, between the goodbye and the maybe, that we finally started to love each other as we never could before, slowly, carefully, and with truth. There wasn't an exact moment when I knew we were together again. There was no proposal, no declaration, no celebration. Just a sequence of days that flowed with such sweet naturalness that when I realized it was him waiting for me outside the bakery, walking me home, getting to know me again through the subtlest things, the way I twist my hands when I'm nervous, how I smile without showing my teeth when I'm embarrassed, how I avoid answering right away when something hurts me. And I, in turn, already knew how to read his silences, understand his pauses, distinguish exhaustion from withdrawal. We were relearning to love each other without the weight of fixing the past, but with the lightness of respecting who we were now. There was a new tenderness, a kind of care that didn't exist before. I didn't need to prove myself. He didn't need to promise me. Being there was enough, and he was there, like never before. Not every day, not in an intense or grandiose way, but he was there. And with time, that was enough for me to let him touch me again. First with his eyes, then with his hands. Finally, with his soul. It was one late afternoon, as I closed the door with him on the inside, that I realized the goodbye we once said hadn't been the end, but a necessary pause. And when he pulled me close, without words, without the intention of possessing me, just holding me there against his chest, I knew I was home. Not because we went back to what we were, but because we were finally something new, and yet familiar. Something that withstood time, silence, absence. Something that had every chance to die but chose to live. And in that moment, with my head resting on his shoulder, I thought of everything we'd been through, everything we'd endured, and whispered to myself, there's no going back, only forward. And what we have now is exactly what we deserve. A love that doesn't need to prove itself because it's already survived the hardest test of all, losing each other and still finding each other again. And that's how goodbye became forever. Not because we swore it, but because we chose it. We chose again. And this time, for real. Some loves don't end. They just change shape, retreat, hide, wait. For a long time, I thought what we had was a beautiful mistake, an intense and brief chapter in a life that moved on without a happy ending. But I was wrong. What we had was never about fleeting intensity or permanent missteps. It was about time, about maturing, about losing each other to finally understand how to truly find each other. Today, when he holds me without saying a word, when he sits beside me just to share the silence, when he makes my coffee the way I like without asking, I understand that love isn't in the spectacular gesture, but in the consistency, in the detail, in the quiet staying. Ethan isn't the man who promised me the world. He's the man who came back, who stayed, who transformed. And I'm no longer the woman who begged for scraps of presents. I'm the one who learned to be enough, and because of that, can now choose to love without losing myself. Love triumphed, yes, but not because we overcame everything like in the movies. It triumphed because, after the chaos, the exhaustion, the distances, and the silences, we were still able to look at each other and say, I'm here. And that to me is the truest forever there could be.